This video is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Hello everyone, my name is Ziamaro and welcome to Battlerite Sage. So, as many of you may have noticed already, yesterday was the final day of Season 2, and that means it's patch day today and the beginning of Season 3. And with that patch comes a host of new changes, both to individual champions and to some of the base systems. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the general updates. First off, the controversial one. Starting today, there will be no more 2v2 in solo queue. I think most of you are aware of this, so I won't delve any deeper. All I'll say is, if you really don't like 3v3, I'd highly recommend finding someone to queue with and play some pre-made 2v2. The next general change is the round timer. Up until now, that's always been set to 2 minutes. Today, it's been reduced by 30 seconds. Jump in game and see, but I think for most games you won't notice a difference. The only time you'll really feel it is when both teams are playing very turtily. You know those games where every round ends on the death vortex? Yeah, those games will be over a little more quickly now. Also in general updates is a mention of memory optimization. Keep your fingers crossed, but maybe this will solve some of the memory leak issues Battlerite has. And finally, as with every season change comes the end of season rewards and new sponsors moving into the new season. First off, you have this awesome new Blossom skin and staff. There will also be a sponsor to earn yourself Ruh Kaan, Thorn and Xander chests, but the sponsor I'm most excited about is the new Fox mount. I don't know about you guys, but I think the sponsor mounts have been the best rewards in every season so far. This thing looks awesome. And speaking of skins and rewards, today we see the return of the prehistoric event. So there will be lots of cool skins for you to find if you're into the caveman look. But actually, there is another great skin that's been added in this patch. The new BPL mount. It's basically just a flying version of the BPL logo, but it looks really cool. You'll only be able to get it from BPL chests, which are obtainable from predicting matches, participating in official tournaments, or buying them through Twitch. But enough about skins. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the patch notes with the champion updates. So, in the interest of keeping this video short, I'm gonna brush over stuff we already know. We already knew about the M2 healing cooldown change and the weaken stacking change. If you didn't know about this, I did a video about it last week, so I'll leave a card to that video. But two things that weren't mentioned before are the knockback mechanic change and in-caps. So starting today, when you get knocked back, you'll actually have some control over your character while you're being pushed back. For example, if you try to go in the opposite direction to where you're pushed, you won't go as far. If you try to go perpendicular to where you're pushed, you'll curve a bit, maybe avoiding a wall. We'll have to wait until we all get in game to test this out more extensively, but this could be quite interesting, especially against champions like Freya who have a very long knockback. The other change is to the incapacitate mechanic. Up until now, if you shielded an ally who was incapped, sure, you'd prevent damage, but you'd also stop the incap from breaking. Starting today, incaps will break even through shields. Honestly, this is how it should have worked all along. It almost felt a bit punishing if your teammate got incapped and you tried to save them by throwing a shield on them, only to keep them locked down for longer. Now onto the more specific changes. First, I'm gonna just ignore the M2 healing changes. The most important thing to know is that in a 3v3, the cooldowns are exactly the same as they ever were. It's only when the teams become uneven that cooldowns start to look different. If your team is a man down, you'll have slightly shorter cooldowns than before. If your team eliminates one person on the enemy team, you'll have slightly longer cooldowns than before. I've put a table on screen that shows the before and after. I'll leave a link to the table in the video description too. I'm also going to skim over buffs to unused rights. If something has got buffed to the point where it might be useful and I miss it, let everyone know down in the comments. So first off, Ashka has only received a buff to his lesser used right Molten Core, and his EX Space has also had a visual update. Moving swiftly on to Bako, he has had some buffs to his lesser used rights, Heroic Leap, Adrenaline Rush and Dizzying Dash. The more significant changes are to Red Axe and Adrenaline Slam. Red Axe has had its healing rebalanced a little. You now get less base healing from this right, but more healing per stack. So on 3 stacks, it's actually a slight buff, but for 1 or 0 stacks, it's a nerf. Adrenaline Slam has also been buffed slightly, just a small damage increase. Next, let's look at Blossom. I'll ignore the M2 cooldowns as I explained earlier, so the only major change to Blossom is a slight reduction on the stun bonus from Pollen. Honestly, I was bracing myself for more nerfs to Blossom, so I think she got off lightly here. Next, we have some perhaps unexpected nerfs to Destiny. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but I know there are some high-level players who called this one. So, the silence portion of Destiny's right click has been toned down considerably. The spell block duration has been cut in half, and the silence duration is now proportional to how long you charge up the right click. Up until now, you could do a minimum cast on her right click and still get a full duration silence. Now it scales from 0.4 seconds to 0.8 seconds. On the top end, that's actually slightly longer than before, but it's definitely a nerf overall. Her System Shock right has been changed to match as well. It no longer gives a flat silence duration increase, it now scales depending on how long you charge it up. Her Plasma Wall has had its duration reduced by 20%. The Plasma Accelerator right has also had a slight change. It will no longer accelerate allied projectiles that are already affected by projectile speed reduction from another source such as Pearl Bubbles. Ugh, that's a mouthful. Next up, we have Jade. Jade's mouse 1 distance has been increased by around 2 or 3%. Also, 2 of her Battlerites have received a buff. Surprise Shot, one of her mouse 2 rights, has had its stun duration bonus increased slightly, while her E-right, Delight, has had its healing increased by 25%. Delight has always been a good pick for Jade, so it's a small but decent buff for her. Next, we have one of the champions who has received a lot of changes, Jamila. Her R has had both its damage and healing reduced slightly, her space has had its max damage reduced slightly, and the first strike after her counter being procced has had its damage reduced slightly. That's a 10 to 15% damage reduction on each of those. However, one positive change to her base kit is the ultimate. It might not be 100% useless anymore. Starting today, the only part of her ultimate that can be countered or parried is the initial dash that the ultimate does. After that, the ultimate acts like an AoE, so it doesn't trigger counters or directional shields. The damage from it has also been rebalanced. It strikes less times, but each strike hits for more. If the whole thing hits, it does about 10% more damage than before. And on top of that, the damage is now a full AoE instead of a cone. Unfortunately for Jamila players though, the nerfs keep coming. 4 of her commonly picked rights have also been nerfed. Her green M2 right has had its healing reduced, Quick Strike, her space recast, has had its range reduced, and you only get the recast if you actually hit your space in the first place. Her purple E right has had its damage reduced slightly, and her R right, Go for the Throat, has had its stun duration bonus reduced. All in all, pretty hefty nerfs for Jamila. Next up, we have Older. Not much to talk about here, other than the M2 changes that almost all supports are getting. The energy gain from his space has been reduced, and the duration of his EXQ Chronoflux has also been reduced. Moving on to Ruh Kaan. His EX Mouse 1 has had its healing increased slightly, his space has had its radius reduced slightly, and his ultimate now does 1 extra tick of damage. But the most significant changes are to his Dragon Palm and Riposte right. Dragon Palm has been nerfed a bit. He now has to wait a little bit longer between casting the first Dragon Palm and then recasting. Before the patch, there was so little time to react between the first and second Dragon Palm that if Ruh Kaan hit you into a wall with the first one, he was almost guaranteed the second, and that does 48 damage. There's now a little more time between the first and second Dragon Palm, so you might be able to dodge out of the way now. The other major change is to his Riposte. That's the right that stuns people at the end of parry's duration. It's been reworked into a recast instead now. Honestly, this change kinda makes sense to me, but it's worth noting that it's definitely a buff to Ruh Kaan. Against decent players, with the old Riposte, you had to be in the habit of cancelling parry if your opponent had their counter available. It feels strange to be punished for not doing something. Now you get punished for doing something, namely recasting the parry. I think this is a little more consistent with how other abilities work in Battlerite. And as a bonus, it actually makes Riposte a lot more viable at high ranks too. Next we have, Shifu buffs. Well, actually it's a mixed bag for Shifu. His Mouse 2 has had its base damage increased slightly, and so has his incap. But the cast time on the incap has been increased, so it might be easier to dodge. And probably the main reason this isn't a flat buff to Shifu is the removal of his Swift Feet Battlerite. This is the right that made him move faster while immaterial. Personally, I always felt this ability was what made him so hard to punish, so the removal of it is a pretty big nerf. To, compensate, Shifu has been given a new right, Ready Defense. If you hit someone with a Mouse 1 while immaterial, you get the readiness buff when immaterial ends. This buff basically just gives you bonus damage to your Mouse 1, so you get a little bit of burst when immaterial ends. He's also had the Skewer right re-added. This right makes his Mouse 2 inflict a fading snare for 0.5 seconds and an extra 0.2 seconds per stack. So at 4 stacks it's a 1.3 second fading snare. and that's actually quite strong in my opinion. Next, we have some tire nerfs. Her left clicks no longer receive bonus damage while haste is active. The haste factor from her space has been reduced slightly. Her crosscut right has been toned down in terms of the individual boomerangs, but it still does the same damage at the intersection. But believe it or not, the biggest change here is the addition of a sound effect to her X-Strike. I mentioned it in a video just a few days ago, but up until now, this thing behaved like a silent Jade Snipe that could be cast while moving. It was also Tyre's strongest selling point. The addition of a sound effect is potentially a huge nerf to Tyre. Next up, we have Thorn. He has received some slight buffs. His ultimate now does a little more damage over its duration. Honestly, not a big deal. It's kind of rare that you catch someone in the full duration. His Whiplash right has had its cast time reduced slightly. Again, not a big deal, hardly anyone picks this right. But finally, his Sinister Sap right now increases healing by 2. This right is picked quite often, so this is probably the main buff to Thorn. Moving on to Ulrich. He has actually received some buffs this patch. Enchanted Weapon, one of his Mouse 1 rights, now also increases the stun duration by 0.2 seconds, in addition to increasing the damage by 3. Penitence, the space right that works like a healing dampener, has had its bonus damage increased slightly. Also, 2 of his E-rights have been buffed slightly. A longer snare on Holy Shackles and more damage on Holy Fire. The most interesting addition though is the new right, Divine Abundance. With this right, when Ulrich heals an ally who has the favor buff, he also heals himself for 8 health. This is a really solid addition to his kit in my opinion. And these are actually some pretty solid changes for Ulrich overall. The buffs to his E-rights will perhaps open him up to 2 different playstyles. One that focuses on going in and stunning more often, and one that sits back and smites from range. And finally, we have Xander. Most of the changes are to his lesser used rights. Awestruck, Late to the Show, and Lasting Form are almost never picked anyway. Phantasmagoria isn't picked too often, and the extra health on the clones isn't really that useful. But the extra range on Arcane Shenanigans is quite interesting. This is the right that also makes his M2s bounce off walls. It was always a strong right in certain situations, and this makes it even more interesting. Overall though, no major changes for Xander. And that just about does it for the changes this time. Between the vast number of champion changes and the general changes to gameplay, we should have quite an interesting season ahead of us. Right now, it's too early to say specifically how this will affect the meta. So as usual, I'll do another video later in the week with my first thoughts on the patch. So until then, good luck in your Season 3 placements and maybe see you in game. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please feel free to subscribe for more Battlerite guides, news and discussion. If you'd like to help support the channel and get some unique rewards, then head over to patreon.com/battleritesage. And don't forget to check out twitch.tv/battleritesage. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.